So our second section here is about preserving the environment. And so when we are looking at waste products that come from different living organisms, especially humans as we populate the earth, these waste products need to be dealt with. If they're not dealt with properly, then this will lead to disruption of all the cycles we've been looking at, and also can lead to illness and many deaths and just unsanitary conditions. And so there's kind of a few different ways you can deal with things. It kind of depends on where somebody lives. If someone lives more out in the country, they may have a septic tank that they use for their waste products. Oxidation lagoons are another option. And if somebody lives in a city, they're more likely to have a wastewater treatment plant that's used for the whole city. And so basically, in whichever form it is, the water has to be separated from the waste. And then usually somehow the solid matter, with the water is removed, is broken down by microbes. When we talk about these decomposers and these recyclers, it's important that we use them in order to keep everything going in the environment. And so we can look at something called wastewater treatment. If you've never been to a wastewater treatment plant, you may want to think about a trip. I took a class on a field trip several years ago, so I wouldn't mind going back sometime. But we just kind of were taken through to see the different processes that happen. And so there's a primary process here, and there's a screen where the sewage is pumped through, and the screen kind of removes some of the grit, some of the larger products, and then the raw sewage gets pumped into these settling tanks. Sludge gets passed on, and then sometimes some organisms are added, so that some materials that are still floating and not settling will then float to the bottom, and so they're called flocculations or flocculate in order to do that. So then we have secondary, so we're just breaking things down further as well, so kind of separating out some of the major substances in the primary. And then a lot of times we'll have aerobic microbes that are metabolizing organic molecules and changing them into inorganic. So even when we see, something like when we saw aerobic respiration, turning glucose in the presence of oxygen into carbon dioxide and water. So similar processes here. There's a lot of different ways that can happen as well. And so just changing how these molecules are formed and then breaking them down. And so there could be an aeration tank that also has aerobic microbes. At this point it's called activated sludge because there's a lot of metabolism going on in here. So then this gets separated out again, and so we're just further getting rid of more of that sediment, and so it may be processed further after that as well. At this point, we still can contain pathogens. Pathogens that we're likely to find can be very small, and so they may not have been picked up by this process just yet. And so the water may still need to be disinfected, and a lot of times that's through chlorination. Adding a little bit of chlorine bleach will kill most organisms. We don't want to add too much, but we want to add enough to actually kill. And so this primary and secondary sludge that had been separated out can then be digested by anaerobic microbes, those that are not requiring oxygen. And so then there could be more treatment. If further treatment is necessary, then it would be called tertiary. So primary, secondary, and tertiary. And so this kind of shows the basic process here, but basically we're just getting rid of the larger substances and then eventually getting down to the fluid. The eventual goal is to get drinking water, and so we need to get everything out of it, or as much out of it as possible. A lot of times then this water will be tested after that to make sure that it's actually clean. So when it comes to bioremediation is how we use biology to clean things up. And so in this case, using microbes to clean things up. A lot of times if you see an oil spill, there are certain bacteria that would prefer to use oil as their fuel source. A lot of cells can't do that, but some microbes can. And so if you put the certain type of bacteria into the oil, it will use the oil for energy, and it will break down the oil, and so break down that waste better than if we were to just leave it alone. And so it's sometimes it can be kind of difficult to decide how to actually do this, but definitely microbes can be used in a beneficial way for this. And so a lot of times you can have, when these microbes are living together, they may form biofilms. And so they may actually aggregate around different surfaces, around pipes and different bodies of water. But generally, if there are more of them, then they can break down, you can have more for remediation. So when it comes to clean drinking water, having a system for clean drinking water is very important, because a lot of times without it there can be a lot of illness, there can be a lot of deaths. And so we probably, maybe in the United States, take our clean water for granted a lot of times. And so we avoid a lot of waterborne diseases because there is usually some sort of process for cleaning water before we actually drink it. And so drinking water needs to be potable, which just means drinkable. And so there are systems to do that. A lot of third world countries are not going to have systems to do that. And so there can be a lot of diseases that get passed on, and people may not have clean water to drink. And that can be a large issue. Besides just looking at pathogens and things that would make us ill when it comes to water, sometimes we talked about this one before where we saw the algal blooms, sometimes just upsets of the different cycles. Maybe there's too much oxygen available. Some organisms do really well. And so if some organisms do really well, they have a rapid bloom like algae, then they may be occupying more of the resources than they should. And so it's just upsetting the balance of everything. Not to mention that they can produce toxins, and those toxins can get into the water and can infect fish, and they can die as well. So things can die because they end up not having enough oxygen available because all the algae are using them, or they can die because of the toxin or those toxins that are passed on. So how do we know if water is safe to drink? You might look at water and think it looks clean, but how do we know for sure? Sometimes you might look at water and think it doesn't look clean, but maybe it just has minerals in it, and it can be kind of hard to say. And so we have to hopefully rest easy knowing that somebody is out there testing the water that we deem fit, or so that they deem it fit to drink. And so there's no way that you would ever be able to detect all microbes that could be in the water. If you're trying to test for viruses and protozoans and different types of bacteria, it can be really hard. And so what we use is something called an indicator organism. It's kind of like the saying, a canary in a coal mine. If we, send the canary in, the canary dies, well then obviously humans shouldn't go in. This is kind of similar in that if we find any of these indicator organisms in our water, well, if those guys are there, then what else might be there that we don't know? And so a common indicator organism to use, it's easy to use, I'm actually doing this in my microbiology lab right now, is looking for coliform bacteria. And so these are gram-negative bacteria that are found in intestines. These could be human intestines, animal intestines, and so they're going to end up in the water when it comes to sewage. If that water is cleaned properly, then this bacteria should eventually be killed off. And so if you're testing water and you want to see if it's clean, you look for these certain types of bacteria. They're pretty easy to find. Bacteria is easy to grow. It's easy to test for. And drinking water should have none. And so if we put this drinking water in with some lactose broth, a lot of these coliforms, they will ferment lactose. That's kind of one of their characteristics. If we get fermentation of lactose, we'll see growth, and we'll see that there are bacteria in the water. And so there's a lot of different techniques out there, but that's what the goal is, to tell you if you have these things. If you have any coliform bacteria in there, then probably you have a lot of other things and you do not want to drink this water. So there's not really an acceptable number of coliform bacteria for drinking water. Swimming water, bathing water, maybe a little bit, but drinking water, definitely not. So when it comes to water treatment, when we look at the process as far as how we're going to actually clean water, so we have a wastewater treatment plant, but then turning that waste into actual drinkable water is kind of taking things a step further. And so we saw kind of before the sedimentation and filtration, and so we can see some different methods with that. There's a lot of kind of different methods out there, but all kind of a basic general idea. And so then chlorination afterwards. And so the chlorine gas actually disinfects. When we use chlorine bleach to disinfect, it has that chlorine in there. And so it's usually pretty good at killing a lot of things. Sometimes in this case, water may be softened or may be fluoridated as well. It kind of depends on where a person lives and what their city does as well. But certain things can be added to it to make it, nicer as far as the softening for a shower. It doesn't build up as much on your shower doors and things like that. And then fluoridated, of course, to prevent cavities as well. And so if anybody was ever out, in the wild and had to rely on drinking some sort of water that they weren't sure if was clean, a good rule of thumb is to add 1/2 of a teaspoon of chlorine bleach to 2 gallons of water. If it sit, you shake it up and let it sit for 30 minutes, it should be safe to drink. It's not a lot of chlorine to add to it, but it's enough to kill everything, but also not enough to make you ill or whatnot. So we kind of want to think with this chapter that, some of the things that we've seen is how important these cycles are for the environment, but also then how do we make sure that we are safe and, our water is safe and we're able to kind of clean up things the best that we possibly can.